Hello, everyone, and welcome to Language Development. We are going to discuss Baker's Chapter 19 in this section, in this video. So before we get into the actual content of Chapter 19, I just wanted to give you a broad overview of the chapter. So the chapter talks a lot about the role bilinguals play in the economy, especially the international economy, and also it talks a lot about language maintenance when there's many different influences from global mass media and global economic forces. And so some of you might be asking, why are we exactly focusing on this when we're trying to focus on how we're going to best address our students who are either bilingual or English language learners, or maybe even learn ourselves as educators how language can best be taught to students? Well, the first point I would make is that since you are going to be advocates for your students, and not just advocates for learning that grade level content, but also learning the skills that they'll need to be successful in the future, this chapter will be very useful because this will teach you the theory behind why bilingualism is worthwhile, especially in the global job market and in the 21st century. So you'll learn that theory, and then when your students ask you questions like, how can I be a successful person as an adult? Or, why are we learning this? Or why should I learn another language, a foreign language, for example? Then you can reference this chapter and explain all the benefits of being bilingual. And this can also be a way that you can encourage your students to maintain their first language. So if they're English language learners and their native language was something other than English, then these could be arguments you could use in favor of them maintaining their language. And also, if you are a foreign language teacher, or if you have students who are interested in learning a second language, you can further encourage them by using some of the content that we discuss in this chapter. Moreover, a lot of these concepts of this chapter involve things that we deal with daily. So the economy, the job market, mass media, the internet, television, entertainment, and tourism as well. So all these issues are daily issues that we face every day, and they're relevant to our lives as well. So even outside the scope of just what we will use inside our classroom, this is important information to know for our lives. So let's go into the content. So first we have occupational bilingualism. So Baker in this section is describing how bilingualism is used in the workforce or in the labor market, in the business world, I guess you could say. So Baker points out that due to increased globalization, increased interconnectedness between countries, and increased global trade, increased reliance on other countries for products, for services, and for aid, for example, during times of crisis, because we have this increased globalization and interconnectedness between other countries, bilinguals have become more and more important to the workforce. Fortunately for us, since we are all proficient and fluent speakers of English, we are also very high in demand internationally because English, as we've talked about before, is a global language. So industries in which bilingualism are particularly important are tourism, business, law, teaching, which is the field we are in, and then diplomacy and national security. And we're going to go into each of them a little bit. Since the September 11th attacks, bilingualism has been even further emphasized for members of the National Security Committee. Some of the languages that they're focusing on is Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Farsi, Hindi, and Korean. And these languages are becoming both more economically powerful, and they're also, the nations that are speaking these languages are becoming more militarily powerful as well. So in order for the United States to preserve its power, its global power, politically and economically, we are asking our citizens to learn these languages, to communicate with these groups. So Baker then goes into the difference between a high prestige job and a low prestige job. And so a high prestige job would be something where someone gets lots of respect, they earn a high salary, and they earn a high quality of life. A low prestige job would be the opposite, where someone is earning lower wages, they're more likely to be in a subordinate position, taking orders and responding to those orders, and having less autonomy at their work. And moreover, they're more likely to unfortunately have a lower quality of life in the low prestige jobs. So Baker explains that there are a variety of jobs that bilinguals have, and some of them are high prestige and some of them are low prestige. So for the high prestige jobs for bilinguals, tourism, translators, government officials, people in the caring professions, so that could be healthcare providers, mental health providers as well, psychologists, psychiatrists, and also religious workers. So those people normally have high prestige, but they're also benefited by being bilingual. They can communicate with more groups of people. They can often progress more quickly or move up in their fields of work, and they can reach more people. So especially in these service-oriented types of jobs, the more people you can serve, the more effective you are in your position. On the other hand, there are some low prestige jobs that bilinguals often have, but many times the reason why they're low prestige, or why bilinguals are occupying these positions, are because these people are normally coming from an immigrant background, and their bilingualism and their English ability in particular is an ascendant level, so it's improving. It's probably not perfect yet. And so their language ability is still growing, and that could be one reason. It also could be a matter of level of education. But then a third reason that could be, as according to Baker, why many bilinguals are ending up in low prestige jobs is because there is some implicit bias and explicit bias against certain groups. So by explicit bias, it's like outgoing, it's in the open, it's direct, and you can be easily observed. And so the explicit bias might be where someone chooses to not hire someone based on their accent, or the fact that there are other people that communicate a little more effectively in English, even though maybe that person that they didn't hire has more relevant job experience and job skills. Another issue could be implicit bias or discrimination, and that's less easy to observe. It's harder to exactly determine. It's more of a subtle kind of bias, but this could be where certain companies want to hire people that look like them, or want to hire people that, I don't know, exemplify a certain culture that they prefer, what have you, or they prefer people, once again, that don't have an accent, or maybe who were grew up in the community since they were children, and they've been in that community and they've known those people for their whole lives. So anyway, that's more of an implicit bias or discrimination. But either way, both of these systems could lead to bilinguals, especially immigrants to a country, as having less occupational opportunities and taking low prestige jobs. So something that Baker described in the chapter that was interesting is what students observe in the school setting. And so this really depends on what community you live in and what school system you work in or have gone to. But some school systems, the majority of the professionals with the prestigious jobs, like the teachers and the administrators, are primarily monolingual English speakers. So they're Their only language is English. They might be able to communicate slightly in another language, but their main language is English. And then the staff that has kind of the less prestigious jobs, the relatively lower jobs, such as the cafeteria workers, the janitors, the paraprofessionals, they are the ones that are bilingual. Many times they are actually English language learners who are still developing their English, but some of them are also just might be fluent, balanced bilinguals as well. But either way, both bilingual students or English language learners and the monolingual students can see this dynamic take place in the schools. And subconsciously, they might think, it's beneficial for me to be monolingual in English. The more English I know, the higher up I can move in the system. The most successful adults I've seen are the ones that speak the most English and speak it all the time. Whereas the ones that are somewhat less successful economically are the ones that are bilingual and using both languages interchangeably in their workplace. However, this is a misconception because, as we'll see later, this is just a result of maybe tradition and educational opportunities and economic opportunities, maybe implicit bias that we talked about a little earlier. So this is not necessarily indicative of what the research has shown is actually beneficial for job outcomes. So later, as we'll go into it, the more languages you know, being bilingual is actually beneficial. So students might not understand that at first, but you can explain to them as a teacher that being bilingual is very beneficial. For example, it's much easier as a teacher to get a job if you're bilingual. There's a lot of demand for bilingual teachers, and there's actually a shortage of bilingual teachers. Where I'm from, the bilingual teachers make about 5% more than the 5 to 10% more than the non-bilingual teachers. And the reason why they offer that stipend is because there's been a shortage historically of bilingual teachers, and there's a growing community of students that need bilingual teachers. So you could explain that to students, maybe not necessarily emphasize the differences in pay between the teachers at the school, but you could still explain how in many professions being bilingual is beneficial and can lead to higher salaries and easier, more job opportunities, easier access to jobs. So now let's shift to bilingualism and tourism. So bilingualism is, of course, a very important skill in tourism. And one reason why tourism is incredibly relevant to us today is that the jobs in tourism and the industry of tourism has become ever more prevalent and important. As you all know, more and more people in the United States are taking vacations, and when they're doing these vacations, they're often going abroad and experiencing a different culture and a different language. Furthermore, tourism across the world has grown because, in general, incomes have risen across the globe, and there's been more disposable income and more income that can be spent on leisure activities. So one positive thing with travel and tourism is that often it increases the contact of cultures and languages. The only negative thing, though, is sometimes that contact is not always positive. There can be cultural insensitivities that can occur with tourism. So first, one issue that could occur is that some groups of tourists just expect that the native population will mirror their home communities, or that the native population will adjust their way of life to meet the tourist, or they will accommodate the tourist culture instead of the other way around. So I saw this, for example, in Spain when I went to Spain on vacation for about 3 weeks right after high school, and I went to this little island called Mallorca, which is a very famous attraction, and it's especially famous in Europe. And so when I was there, most of the people I saw actually on the beaches and in the shops and everything were from Germany and Holland, and it was interesting because a lot of the restaurants were in German or in Dutch. They spoke Dutch, and there was a big emphasis on those cultures. And it was interesting because the tourists from those countries didn't really interact with the Spanish population. They mostly just stayed with their own groups, and then they often frequented their own types of restaurants. So it really wasn't an actual cultural interchange. So I thought that was interesting. But that wasn't a case where I would say most of those tourists were kind of expecting that the culture would mirror what they saw in their home countries in Germany and Holland, and that they would just have the Spanish beautiful beaches in the background to kind of add, a little bit of context to everything. Another problem is that sometimes tourists take an ethnic approach toward tourism, in the sense that they want to highlight kind of the cultural practices, but they want to highlight them for negative reasons. Like they want to look at them because they think, oh, they're so cute, or they're so strange and unusual. We just have to see it in action. So they don't really they appreciate it not for its meaning, but more because it's a novelty, it's a show, it's something unusual that maybe they've heard of, from stereotypical movies or books or whatever, what have you. And so this is a problem because this minimizes the native culture, and it focuses on a stereotyped impression of that culture, and it focuses on novelty rather than the meaning of the traditions. Another critique of tourism is that it emphasizes seasonal employment and temporary workers from other countries that come over, and they don't really adapt to the culture, or they don't really appreciate the native culture. They're just there just to make a quick buck and leave. And so that's another critique of tourism. On the other hand, there's a positive form of tourism, which is called cultural tourism. And it emphasizes bilingualism. And so in that case, it emphasizes the native language and also the native culture. And so it encourages the tourists to become bicultural, so to be able to navigate between cultures, and also to become bilingual, so they can navigate, at least at the minimal level, at the incipient level, they can do basic conversation in that language. And another good thing about this form of tourism, the cultural tourism, is that often, since it's emphasizing the value of the native culture and the native language, it also emphasizes the value of the native environment. And so it protects the native environment. It also ensures the continuation of the native traditions, and it's accurate to what the native traditions really are, and it explains the meaning and the purpose of the traditions. It's not just putting on a show. Now let's talk about bilingualism and mass media. So Baker defines mass media as television, radio, phones, the internet, computers, basically any way that messages are communicated digitally. And so Baker points out that satellite television has increased interconnectedness between countries. It has enabled this concept of global village, where almost instantly you can find out the news, the sports, and the culture all across the world. If you want, you can watch a cricket match taking place in India using your satellite TV, or you could watch the World Cup taking place in another country. You could furthermore watch a documentary about a culture in New Zealand, and you could learn the news of what's going on in Syria, for example. So, and all of that is right at your fingertips almost instantly. And so, in many ways, Baker argues that television can be a positive contribution to bilingualism and biculturalism, because it allows viewers to experience new cultures and get to know also new languages. However, there's a qualification in that one also has to be considerate of how currently English is overrepresented, um, especially the American English and the British English. It's overrepresented on television, movies, and in the internet. And because of that, some people argue that television, for example, in particular, emphasizes Anglo-American culture and the English language. And so one critique of that, or one critique of having too much English on television, is that other cultures aren't really being represented, other languages aren't being represented. So, for example, if you're in China and most of your channels are in English, or half your channels are in English, then someone might argue that your language is being displaced by English, your native language of Mandarin or Cantonese or Szechuan, whatever was your native. There's many different dialects in China. So, kind of going into that more deeply. So there's positives of the spread of English through television, and we kind of talked about them a little bit, but many times it can increase a person's second language abilities in English. So if you're a non-native English speaker in another country, or maybe even a non-native English speaker in the United States, when you watch TV and it's regularly in English, or when you watch movies that are primarily, the Hollywood movies are in English, you're developing your language. And so that can be an additive context because you're developing your second language, English, and ideally you wouldn't be replacing your first language. You would maintain your native language. An example of this might be in Scandinavian countries like Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. And in those countries, it's interesting, the media, like the television and the movies, are not dubbed, so they're not, the actors don't speak in the native language, and you can hear the native language. Instead, almost all of the movies and television, especially for the teenagers and adults, are subtitled. So you'll hear the English, the actors speaking English, but then they will translate it at the bottom into the native language. And so this is a way that they've been able to develop their second language abilities. And of course, they're not forgetting their first languages either, just because they watch some TV and some movies in English. So that's an additive context because they're keeping their native language, especially since they have to translate it in the subtitles into their native language, but they're also learning their second language, which is English. There are some negatives, though, with English being kind of the dominant force in mass media. So one issue is that certain countries are worried that some English words are kind of intermixing into their language, and so people are kind of using some English terms instead of the traditional native language terms. And so some countries are particularly worried about that, like Japan and France. France in particular, the government has even taken steps to make sure that the vast majority of the media presentations on TV and on the radio are in French. So because they believe their French language is at risk of being displaced by English. And also maybe by Arabic, because there's a large Arabic-speaking community in France. So when the native language is displaced by the dominant global language like English or Mandarin, then that would be a subtractive context because the people are, yes, they're growing in their second language, the global language of English or Mandarin, but they're losing their first language. So their language abilities are decreasing overall. So it's called a subtractive context. Okay, let's go now a little bit more into the mass media. So going back to some additive situations, so these are positive situations where people maintain their first language and they develop further their second language. In some countries, many channels also there are many minority language channels for minority language speakers. And so an example in the United States would be Univision and Telemundo. And both of these channels are completely in English, and they have tens of millions of viewers. And they're providing that resource of Spanish to across the United States, to people who live from Texas to Alaska. And so it's providing that opportunity for those speakers of the minority language Spanish to have access regularly to news and entertainment in their native language. I've also seen this when I've traveled to New York City, that area. They have some channels in Mandarin Chinese, Italian, and also in Canada, they have a mixture of French channels and English channels. So even though the minority language is French, a smaller percentage speak French than English, they're still heavily represented in the mass media in Canada. So Baker identifies several benefits of having minority language radio, television, and movie channels. And this would be, once again, an additive context. So speakers of a minority language, for example, Spanish in the United States, are maintaining their heritage language, their native language, and they're also still developing their English abilities in school and in other settings. So the first reason why preserving a native language with the use of mass media channels is that it adds prestige to that minority language. So if they have many channels on TV, in movies, and in radio that are especially attractive, for example, to young speakers, then this can help encourage those young speakers to continue to practice that language. A second reason that it's beneficial to have these minority language channels is that it also develops a sense of unity and identity among people of a community, especially like a diaspora community where immigrants have left their home country and gone to a new country, and they might be spread out, or they might be in different enclaves, but still it's a way to unify a group of people and to allow them to communicate with each other, and to also inform them of the news and of community resources. A third reason why having minority language channels are beneficial toward bilingualism is that it allows the speakers of that native language to feel comfort. They can see their language and their culture present in their everyday life on their TV screens or on the radio channels or in movies. But moreover, it allows them a feeling of comfort also that once again they can stay abreast of the news and they can be informed of what's going on in their local communities so that they can participate better in those local communities. A fourth reason why is that it also can help standardize the form of a language. So if you watch Univision or Telemundo, they have a very high level of language that's spoken there. And it's useful because there's Spanish speakers in the United States from across Latin America. There's Spanish speakers from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Mexico, of course, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador. And the Spanish from each country is very different. And so you can't assume that someone that's speaking the Spanish from El Salvador has the same types of academic vocabulary or even casual vocabulary as someone who's speaking Spanish from Panama, for example. So with that in mind, the benefit of having those minority language channels is that it helps to standardize the language, and it also encourages them, native speakers, to develop their academic language. So regardless of what kind of language their families are speaking at home, or what level the parents, the educational level of the parents, they are still hearing that high level of academic language. It's being reinforced in the mass media. A fifth reason why it can be beneficial for bilingualism is that it, of course, allows native speakers to build their fluency, but it also gives non-native speakers of minority language, for example, like U.S. foreign language students who are native English speakers, but they're learning a foreign language, it gives them an opportunity to practice and develop their language abilities. One of the ways I personally developed my Spanish language abilities was through listening through Spanish music. That was a really big benefit for me. And so it builds up my bilingualism as a native English speaker who also learned Spanish as a second language. Furthermore, finally, I guess you could say, another benefit of having bilingualism and having these minority language channels is that it provides high-paying jobs for people of that minority community, and so they don't have to travel abroad to find jobs that are high-paying, but they can stay in their home communities and serve their home communities by providing the news or providing entertainment or providing culture in the form of fine arts and music to the local community. So we've talked about how mass media can be an additive context, so how it can benefit local communities. And so we gave the example how it could be additive in, for example, in Scandinavian countries where they maintain their native language, but they use media in English to help supplement their second language abilities in English. Furthermore, we talked about how minority language radio, television, and movie channels are serving as an additive context as well, where those populations are able to maintain their native language, but in the school setting or outside the media, when they're not at home, they're also practicing their second language, which is English. So those are additive contexts. But there could be also some subtractive context with the mass media. And this would be when there's not a significant amount of minority language channels. And then this would be where the children of those of the minority language they don't have a lot of exposure to their native language, and so they're just kind of bombarded with English programming. And so eventually children associate that with the prestigious culture and the prestigious language, and they end up choosing to speak only that English language, to be, that prestigious language. So in our case, it might be someone who, let's say they're a native, native Dutch speaker, for example, in the United States. There's not a lot of Dutch programming that I've seen, and there might be, I don't know, but I haven't seen it really. I haven't seen a lot of channels, for example, even on satellite television in Dutch. So those students might be bombarded with so many channels in English and hearing English in schools, and so they might actually see their native language be diminished, and that would be subtractive because they're losing part of their native language. It could also further weaken the status of their native language. So probably not Dutch, because Dutch is it is a global language and it has a strong following, of course, in Europe. But maybe like Navajo, for example, students who are native Navajo speakers, there might be some concern in that community that if they're only being exposed to media in English and they're not having enough exposure to minority language channels in Navajo, in the radio or on TV or in movies, then those children might shift their language practices primarily just to English. And then there could be less intergenerational transfer of the Navajo language to future generations. So as we've talked about in earlier chapters, English is the dominant language on the internet. In 1999, they found that 80% of the language text, or the text on the internet, was written in the English language, for example. Also, other evidence is in, for example, digital encyclopedias that are published online. If you think of Wikipedia, 3 times as many articles are written in English than in the second and third most popular languages on Wikipedia, which are German and in French. So one issue with this is that you might have many people across the world that view English as the prestigious and modern language that's the language of the technologically advanced, the 21st century, and they might view their native language as kind of somewhat more backwards or historical, maybe useful for traditions and rituals, but not as much relevant in the 21st century. And so this could lead to language loss. Also, another downside is it could be a monopolization of the information for the English speakers. And so on the surface value, it doesn't sound horrible for us because we're fluent English speakers, and we are not necessarily being hurt by this. But if you think about it, first of all, it's not fair that only one group of people has, access to information and access to opportunities and access to communication opportunities to speak with people of their same language. Obviously, that's not fair, and if we were those people, we would not want to be in that position. If the shoe was on the other foot, we would not want that. And second of all, if you think about it even pragmatically for America, it's not good that only certain groups have access to the facts, because then if they don't have access to the facts in their native language, misconceptions and misrepresentations, for example, of America or of other cultures could exist internationally, and they can't be corrected because there's no access to factual information. So, for example, in a country that doesn't have a lot of access to the internet and access to facts in their native language, then the government could theoretically brainwash the population to being angry with the United States, when if they had access to information about our country, they would realize how diverse we are, how much we promote liberty and civil rights and equality for all, and equal opportunities for all. And so there's a lot of really positive things about our country that if it's not being presented to people in their native language, they might not have access to that. So informational technology, if there's a monopolization of informational technology in English, obviously there can be somewhat of a negative, maybe subtractive context. But one thing that Baker notes is that there's now a shift toward more languages being represented on the internet. And the internet, at least inherently or theoretically, provides minority languages with increased opportunities to speak their language and to preserve their language. And there's a couple of reasons why. So the first reason why is that minority languages living within a majority language can, the internet facilitates translation. So like Google Translate, or a lot of our websites now are translated from English to Spanish. I know the WT website for education is actually translated in English, Spanish, Arabic, and Hindi, I believe. And so technology has facilitated the ability to translate things quickly. And also it's been able to provide access to translations at a much more easy level, like to access. And so that can increase the ability of communities to participate in areas like libraries, schools, universities, government offices, because they can now learn about those offices and those community resources in their native language, because the internet can quickly translate into their native language. So that can actually preserve their minority language, and so that would be an additive context. Another additive context for technology could be that it will provide people living in remote communities to speak their minority language with other people. So if they are native, let's say, like, if they're native speakers in the South American Amazon region, and they're kind of spread out in the different indigenous tribes. And so even if they have to relocate for a job or for something, they can still find people using the internet where they can communicate in their native language. Baker notes, though, that in order for languages to be successful using the internet and to develop to grow in number of speakers and in, I guess you could say, power as a language, languages need to also adopt technological terms and modernize their vocabulary to ensure that people who are using the internet can use the internet in that native language and use native language terms to talk about their experiences using the internet. So once again, there's many benefits of the internet to bilingualism. We've talked about social networking, so the opportunity to work with people or to communicate or become friends with people that speak your native language. It also allows for authentic learning practices where you get to learn language from people who are native speakers. So there's a big popular application in China called VIP Kid. And I think there's like 200 million people in China or more that are using that application on their iPads or phones. And what they do is it's a tutoring app where they get connected with a teacher from the United States that's a native English speaker, or maybe a teacher from another country that's a native English speaker. And so it's allowing for authentic language practices for those Chinese students. Also, for example, if you have a fourth grade classroom and your students are wanting to learn another language, let's say they want to learn Spanish, well, you could have web conversations or web chats with another classroom, fourth grade classroom in Mexico that speaks Spanish. And then you could have some days where you speak in English and some days you speak in Spanish. So those authentic language practices in general encourage bilingualism and their additive context. A third reason could be multimedia resources can also help you teach language and learn language. So YouTube videos, websites that explain different facets of language, or online dictionaries, all of these can help encourage people to learn second and third and fourth languages, so they encourage bilingualism. Now let's go back to a little bit more about the economy. So bilingualism in the economy is important because this explains kind of the relevance to what we're learning, to what we can explain to our students, in that bilingualism is an economic advantage. It offers increased international trade, because of the increased global competition. More and more countries are speaking English, and more people are now bilingual across the world. There's an increased need for Americans to be bilingual as well. Also, they've done various studies that have shown that being bilingual provides unique trade opportunities and unique business opportunities. And so one example in the United States is Miami, Florida. So Miami, Florida has a large Spanish-speaking population, but also it is kind of like geographically, it's a place that connects various countries that are Spanish-speaking to the United States. And so it connects U.S. businesses with Latin American businesses. And so in this type of economy, they've done a study in that half of the jobs in Florida require some level of Spanish. So it doesn't have to be a fluent, balanced bilingual in Spanish and English, but it has to have someone that can at least navigate partially in Spanish, maybe an incipient bilingual that can at least exchange pleasantries or everyday language if they have to, or just quick, brief sentences if needed. So half of the people in Florida who are working should ideally be bilingual in Spanish and English. And so this builds up what Baker describes as parallel monolingualism. So parallel monolingualism means that basically bilinguals are serving as these as these intermediaries, these brokers that help people cross linguistic and cultural barriers. So, for example, in Miami, you have monolingual U.S. companies where the majority of the higher ups mostly only speak English, and then you have monolingual Spanish-speaking companies or people who work in Latin American companies who primarily speak Spanish. And then the work of the bilinguals is to help connect those two groups and to help facilitate communication and trade between those two groups. Baker further explains that bilingualism will become more and more important now that there's been a shift in our economic structures. So historically, in the past, a lot of the economies were based on within the nation itself, within one country. There was a focus on producing raw materials or growing crops, and it was like raw resource production, and often the government played an active role. Well, now, in our globalized economy, it's not just at the national level, it's at the international level. And the most high-paying jobs and the biggest demand now is for jobs that provide services and knowledge. So, like they talked about the knowledge economy. And so jobs like in finance, healthcare, education, like we are in, all of these jobs are very desired. And then now the economy is often influenced by multinational companies. So some of the big companies like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Nike, all of these companies are international or multinational companies that might have headquarters in several different countries and have production systems in several different countries. And they are the ones that are really largely influencing the world economy. It's not just one government controlling the means of production, it's the actual multinational companies. And so, taking that into consideration, bilinguals, especially bilinguals who know majority languages or popular languages that are spoken by many people across the world, like English, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Mandarin, French, what have you, those people are going to be the bridge makers or the go-betweens between the multinational companies and the local communities that they're either employing or they're selling their products to. So bilingualism is helping to facilitate global operations. Some further research to justify this is that within the European Union, they found that companies that invested in the language skills of their workforce had 45% more export sales, while the 11% of companies that had lost contracts cited the reason for losing their contracts on their lack of language abilities, their lack of the ability to communicate with their clients in the client's language. So, bilingualism overall has been buoyed by our current global economic structure, but you have to think about what happens to minority languages. So many people from across the world are now learning a second language that is English or Mandarin or Arabic or French, and they're learning these languages and they're becoming bilingual. And so yes, overall, bilingualism is on the rise across the world. But then within some countries, though, minority languages can suffer from changes in the economy. And one reason is that speakers of minority languages, for example, indigenous languages in Latin America, sometimes are often delegated to hold less prestigious positions. Or even in the United States. Often the speakers who are proficient in their native language and developing their second language abilities in English work in jobs such as factories, shops, restaurants, construction, and areas that can sometimes be less prestigious and sometimes be lower paying. And so the speakers of those languages and their children are seeing those people struggle economically, and so the children and those speakers and the speakers themselves are encouraging their children to focus on learning the majority language and maybe less on learning the minority language. The main exception to that would be possibly in some industries where there's bilingual managers that can hold kind of middle class positions, and they help to negotiate between the workers who are mostly monolingual of the minority language and the upper administration, which is monolingual normally in the majority language. But even then, those managers mostly hold kind of middle person or in between status. They're not always going to be, their language skills aren't incredibly valued as much as someone who's helping to facilitate trade for that company. So unless that company is directly involved in international trade in that language that that person speaks, the native language that person speaks, that person will mostly stay at the middle management level as like a floor supervisor or something like that. It'll be a lot harder for them to rise up into the upper status, like the CEO position. Another issue is that sometimes bilingual speakers of indigenous minority languages will be used by companies in a way that actually exploits those minority indigenous communities. So an example of this might be sometimes oil companies or rubber companies in the Amazon will try to recruit bilinguals who are bilingual in the native language, but unfortunately they'll use those bilinguals for kind of nefarious purposes. They'll use them to help negotiate unfair trade deals with the native population, or help acquire land so that they can kind of exploit the natural resources, and and then they leave those communities kind of in ruin and with environmental destruction, and those communities are kind of stuck. I've seen that myself in Ecuador, where oil companies, they came in and they I don't know how, but they kind of took over native land, and then they left these big oil pits, and these basically they polluted the water system, and so people ended up developing large amounts of cases of cancer, and it ended up going into a world court, a world tribunal, and those Amazonian indigenous communities actually won. So anyway, that's an example of how bilingualism can be used for negative ways. So Baker points out that often the languages that are the healthiest, the ones that grow in the number of speakers, and they're able to pass on their language in its purest form to future generations, those languages are the ones where the people themselves are economically wealthy. And so they face less threats or less need to learn another majority language. Another reason why minority languages might be at risk, not only because there's a pressure to become wealthy and to learn the majority language, for example, in the case of Ireland, as Ireland started developing, more and more people wanted to speak English because they felt that gave them economic opportunities. And so that led to a decrease in the speaking of Irish in Ireland. So apart from that, apart from just that economic need or feeling of need to speak the majority language and to kind of forget the minority language, another problem is that many times, just geographically, a lot of the industries that attract people, especially in developing countries, are in big cities. And so this could draw speakers of like rural indigenous languages to those big cities. That urbanization can kind of encourage those people to move to those cities, and then when they get there, the children are more likely to speak the majority language, and so that ends up leading to a decline in the native language. Or another situation where economic conditions can lead to minority language loss is in the case of rural communities that they start to develop possibly certain types of agriculture or factories in the rural communities. And what happens is the big companies are located in the city, and they send their managers who are native speakers of the majority language to those local communities. And then the people who are working in those factories are the local people who speak the minority language. And so the local people that speak the minority language see that their managers are the ones that speak the majority language, and their children see that as well. And so that encourages the children to speak the majority language because they see that's their way to get out of just being a worker and the possibility of being a manager or a leader in that community in terms of business. So another problem with economics and bilingualism, the relationship, is that many times there's economic inequality for bilinguals. And so many times immigrants, for example, are blamed for economic problems. They're considered forces or people that are taking jobs from the native population. And this happens a lot during times of recession when people are really worried about jobs and access to jobs. But Baker counters this notion by saying that immigrants actually benefit the economy of a local country. And so he gives 3 reasons why. So first, immigrants open up new businesses for their own communities and also for the majority language communities. They open up new businesses, creating jobs and also creating tax dollars in the terms of sales tax and property taxes and income taxes. So that's one way. A second way is that immigrants provide an inexpensive labor force, which allows for big corporations to choose to stay within the country and not move their operations to foreign countries that have cheaper labor. A third reason why is that immigrants also, since they're willing to often work for slightly lower wages, it keeps down the cost of businesses and services. And so areas that have high immigrant populations normally have lower construction costs, lower healthcare costs or elderly care costs, and service costs in other areas. And so that can keep down the everyday cost of services and also goods, like lower costs on produce and other materials that require a large, low-skilled, low-wage workforce. And one thing to note is that even though we've talked about like implicit bias and explicit bias, sometimes leading to speakers of minority languages holding on to the less prestigious jobs and not having economic opportunities. In other cases, though, being bilingual and even being a person who's an immigrant who is bilingual is beneficial to your economic progress. And so they gave examples in the text of people in Wales that speak Welsh and English. And so they're bilingual in both languages, and it actually adds to their client base. So they can sell products to both groups of people, or they can make business connections and associations with people who speak Welsh or people who speak English. And so it kind of adds to their business. They were able to have about 10% more economic growth or economic activity than people who were just monolingual in Welsh or monolingual in English. Another example could be many people in different Spanish-speaking communities in the United States. There are many different communities where, like we've said a little bit earlier, that they're starting their own businesses, and there's a lot of growth, and then the children are also being bilingual and obtaining educational opportunities. And so the idea that bilingualism is a negative for economic growth is certainly flawed. Bilingualism is a very positive note. So let's go over the conclusions. So once again, bilingualism is economically valuable. It's important. Baker lists some special reasons that kind of summarize the whole chapter. First, it's easier to gain employment. We've talked about the benefits for tourism, for education, for bilingual teachers, for example, and in business. And so, obviously, it's easier to gain employment if you have at least some second language skills. Furthermore, you can have the opportunity to travel abroad for work. You have more flexibility in terms of the kind of work you can do and where you can work. You could work for the government. You can work for international companies. So all of those things are benefits of being bilingual. Also, they've done studies of people who were bilingual initially, like they were native speakers of Spanish, and then they learned English. And so they did a study. They kind of studied both populations. Those people who spoke Spanish in the beginning and then learned English and then forgot their Spanish. So they ending up being monolingual in English. And then they studied those people with another population who kept their Spanish and remained bilingual, and so they were able to speak English and Spanish. And they found that the people that became monolingual in English did not receive any benefits. In fact, they received negative benefits, whereas the people who remained bilingual and kept their native language received some positive benefits. So just to quickly summarize why this chapter is important. So we talked about it a little bit earlier in the beginning of the chapter, but first of all, the lessons we learn in this chapter can help you when you're working with your English language learner students who maybe might feel frustrated about how long it's taking for them to learn English, or they might feel frustrated that their accent isn't perfect, or maybe there's not enough representation in the media of their culture. So you can help reassure them and explain to them that being bilingual is very valuable, and it will lead to economic growth for them in the future, and that encouragement will help assure that your students are not only successful in school that year, but also successful when they're adults, and that's the end goal of education. Once again, being bilingual is for especially bilingual Spanish and English is a lot more beneficial for our students than just becoming monolingual and forgetting their native language. Another reason why it could be beneficial is, once again, if you're a foreign language teacher, or if you're just a teacher of adolescents that are taking a foreign language, or in general, if you have students that are interested in taking a foreign language, you can be that source of information and encouragement to encourage native English speakers to learn a second language. And this can, once again, assure that your students are having the economic opportunities and allowing them to be competitive in the global labor market. Furthermore, in your own daily lives, the knowledge that we learn in this chapter can be useful for when you do choose to be a tourist, or when you are purchasing goods, or when you are using mass media and informational technology. For example, if as a tourist you might purposely find companies that emphasize cultural tourism, and tourism that emphasizes the native culture and the native language. Or when you're purchasing goods, you might choose to purchase fair trade goods, or the native groups that were producing the products were being paid a fair wage. Or when you're choosing to watch media, then you might choose to watch, to explore minority language channels such as Telemundo and Univision. I mean, I especially watch those during the World Cup series, because they always are broadcasting the World Cup matches, even when English-speaking monolingual channels are not. And so that's a nice bonus. But furthermore, you might want to be checking out more foreign language film and developing your own bilingual abilities. Or you could just be giving attention and support for those language channels that are supporting bilingualism of the native speakers of that language. Furthermore, in your own daily lives, you can also work to improve these conditions, not only for your students, but for other people throughout the world. So thank you very much for listening to my lesson, and I'll talk to you guys soon.